One of the first questions deaf people ask each other is, where did you go to school? In the past, school has had a big impact on deaf identity and the community, and that's still true today. However, deaf children are achieving less than their hearing peers. Deafness isn't a learning disability, so why is this happening? To understand, it's necessary to travel back 400 years to look at the history of deaf education and find out what lessons can be learned. Here in the Action on Hearing Loss library is a very rare book from 400 years ago. This book contains the first mention of education for the deaf. Before this, people thought that deaf people couldn't learn. No one bothered to try giving them an education. But here, for the first time, the author John Bulwer understood the potential of educating the deaf using sign language and stated that a deaf school should be set up. However, it took over a century for anyone to do anything about it. It was Thomas Braidwood who set up a small private school for the deaf in Edinburgh. But only the wealthy could afford the fees to have their children educated.
Today I'm going to be teaching you names of animals. Elephant. Elephant. Very good.
Braidwood himself didn't know sign language. He started off using oral methods, speaking, and over time switched to using sign language. It was a combination of methods because the children themselves used gestures and signs which Braidwood took on board.
My methods are secret, I'm afraid. Like all good educators in Britain now, we must protect our finances and keep it in the family. The proof of my methods is in the quality and achievements of my pupils.
Braidwood's school was really successful because we've seen a number of his pupils succeed in the wider world. One such person was Lord Seaforth, who, although deafened, entered Parliament as an MP.
My son has taken over my work, and I hope someday my grandson will follow in our footsteps so that deaf people can continue to progress.
It started in 1792, and from that point until around the 1860s, we saw the golden age of sign language in deaf education.
Braidwood's teaching methods continued for another 100 years, but it was only after he died that people learned that he was actually using the combined system, the forerunner to total communication. Around the same time in Europe, there was increasing tension between the use of sign language and the German method. Heineck from Germany was formerly in the army. He devised his own method of teaching deaf children to speak. He used touch and taste. Vinegar was used to develop certain speech patterns, as was salt. The term oralism can be ascribed to this man.
Clear thought is only possible in the spoken language. Speech is what separates us from the animals.
Abbé de Lepé's teaching methods were successful. His pupils were well educated and highly literate. One pupil, Pierre de Deloge, actually wrote a book about deaf education. He also argued avidly for sign language, for by this time the new German method was starting to become widespread.
I want you all to talk about the history of the Romans. No one had taught in sign language before. I am the first person in the world to offer a free deaf school which I personally sponsor. Sign language is the easiest way to communicate ideas.
The difference was that Abbé de Lepé wanted the children to use their own sign language, the language they used daily. He learned their street language, and from that, he also produced a set of rules in French, from which they could learn written French as well as fingerspell in French. It became codified, so that whatever signs were used, he translated and taught this back to his pupils. So, he was really using sign language to educate, whereas Heineck rejected these visual cues and focused totally on speech.
Heineck disagreed with de Lepé's methods, and vice versa. There were strong exchanges of views written between the two men.
You believe that your method of teaching the deaf is better than ours? We use sign. It is easier to glean information.
No other method can compare either in point of facility or solidity with that which I have invented and now practice.
Why? Why the focus on speech all the time? Where is the teaching? The development of minds? They'll become animals with no skills.
To disclose something of the invention, it is necessary that you learn the method of tuition from myself, which would require you to stay with me for at least half a year.
Me accept your offer? 6 months? Why, I can teach them in 2 weeks.
Oralism was gaining momentum, and it was strongly supported by educators. Supporters of instruction in sign language and deaf people's views were increasingly ignored. An international conference was set up in Milan in 1880.
The simultaneous use of speech and sign has the disadvantage of injuring speech, lip reading, and the precision of ideas.
Delegates at the 1880 conference visited a deaf school at which they saw that deaf children could speak well and exclaimed that this was what they wanted.
Well, my dad, Mr. Ackerd, have made exhaustive inquiries into the best system of instruction for our deaf daughter, and finally we are fully convinced by the immense superiority of the oral system.
Unfortunately, we have no information as to whether these children were profoundly deaf or just had a slight hearing loss. Audiology didn't exist then. Maybe they were oral successes because the children could hear well, or sat in the front so they could hear the teacher.
Most of the presentations were in favour of oralism, believing that this was the way deaf children could have the same opportunities as hearing children. Those in favour of sign language numbered just a few.
I much defend the combined system, so the natural language of the deaf, and also the mother tongue of all mankind.
In my long and earnest work, I gave up the signs because they injured the speech. I gave up the combined method because they injured the voice. Only the pure oral method has not failed.
Signs grow naturally through the mind. Consider two deaf mute together were perceived to develop the language of sign, not through the English language, but through the language of sign.
There were personal views and experiences given about oralism, but later research showed no evidence to substantiate these claims. No deaf person addressed the conference. 160 delegates voted for oralism, with just 4 against.
With that decision, by teachers, not by deaf people, by teachers, oralism was deemed superior. Just as speech had been deemed superior in order to communicate with God, oralism was now superior to signing.
The Congress, considering the incontestable superiority of speech over signs in restoring the deaf-mute to society and in giving him a more perfect knowledge of language, declares that the oral method should be preferred.
Milan was the greatest crime committed on the deaf community in the history of the world.
After Milan, a royal commission was set up which recommended that speech was the best way forward and that sign language should be dropped. There were no deaf people involved in the commission.
Immediately after the Milan conference, the oralists wrote to all the leading newspapers in the world, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the London Times, and so on, announcing what had happened at this conference. The newspapers were obviously taken with this, giving the news pages and pages and pages of coverage, stating how wonderful the oral system was. Those who favoured sign language were just too slow off the mark, so that by the time they did act, the damage had already been done.
Most deaf teachers who taught deaf pupils through sign language found themselves out of work. Here at number 12 was the college where hearing recruits were trained in how to teach the oral method.
It's clear that after oralism was chosen to be the preferred method, there was colonisation. Colonisation itself is a system rather than an ad hoc event such as raiding a town and taking their gold. It's a systematic means of establishing force and brainwashing people. Oralism, therefore, was a system perpetuated by controlling the teacher training colleges. We could only lip read and speak for 1 hour. No signing was allowed. It was frustrating. I hated it. When I tried to speak, I felt disappointed with myself, and it made me feel really small. Classes were always the same. Speech, spelling, and then signing. We used to alternate between all three. Which was better?
As the century moved on, oralism became a more powerful force. But teaching wasn't so much about imparting knowledge. The emphasis was almost exclusively on learning to speak.
The teachers couldn't sign, they'd only talk. It was frustrating. They'd tell us we had to learn to speak the words, but whenever they were writing on the blackboard, we were signing behind their backs, checking with each other what had been said. Lip reading was hard, and I got really fed up.
La la la, they'd say. La la la. Then they'd force their fingers in your mouth, push your tongue upwards, and be really in your face with bulging eyes. And for what? I can laugh now, but when I look back, it's so sad and makes me really angry. We needed lessons to make us think. Speech lessons weren't going to do that. We didn't know what they were talking about. Education should be about using your brain to think.
We should have had the full curriculum, such as science, how things worked, or where things come from.
Can somebody find me that town on the map? That's right. Now that's called Dnepropetrovsk. I want you to say that all together. Dnepropetrovsk.
Most teachers were trained using the Ewing approach. This forced them to adopt strict oralist methods. If a teacher didn't have the Ewing stamp of approval, then they found it impossible to gain employment.
But we had misgivings because we weren't allowed to use normal gesture. If I said, well, I don't know, oh, you mustn't do that. You must say, I don't know. It was as strict as that.
I didn't have the tools or the permission. It goes back to the sort of thing, you did what you were told, to teach in any other way, really. That was the problem.
Now say, I can hear you. I can hear you.
You can teach a parrot to speak, but that doesn't mean the parrot understands. Deaf schools were just like that.
It's a wonder they didn't go mad, really, you know. I sometimes wonder how they survived. I really do.
As we entered the post-war years of the 1950s and 1960s, there was great hope that new technology would further aid the development of speech.
After the war, audiology was fully introduced, so we saw things like hearing aids and so on. This led to the start of measuring degrees of hearing loss, such as profound, severe, or partial. We had to guess words that were uttered from behind a piece of paper. Train, aeroplane, motorbike, and car. When I got it wrong, the sound would be turned up. It was painful, and I protested. No, I had to hear. I was in agony and finished every session with sore red ears. The indoctrination was awful.
This idea of using audiometry with children who have no hearing I mean, it's futile.
Schools adhered to the oralist approach, for sign language had been banned. In the playground, however, children would secretly sign. Later, oralism became more and more strict, and children caught signing in the playground or dormitory would be severely punished.
I had to write lines. I must not sign, I must talk. I must not sign, I must talk. I had to do that for over an hour.
There were 6 beds in this dormitory. Once the teacher had left, we all sat up to sign to each other. I was told off the first time I was caught, but after being caught again, they made this garment. A straitjacket, effectively. I was strapped down and couldn't move my arms. They were tied beneath me. And later in the night, when I wanted to go to the toilet, well, I couldn't.
These boys had no voice. They couldn't fight the system. The teachers and schools would impose their wills on them. It was impossible.
I've seen many of my friends ruined by the education system. On the other hand, our social network and sports activities were excellent. So, the social side was great, but educationally, it was terrible.
I just think it did a lot of children a disservice. Instead of doing what it should have done, which would be to give them a good service, to get them on and make them able to live in the outside world and so on and so forth. I think it stunted them, really. And I think a lot of their education came when they left school and they educated themselves, you know.
It was around the 1960s when things went badly wrong, with most deaf people failed by the education system. That was because too much time was spent on learning how to speak.
It seems that in the majority of cases, the era of oralist education was a dismal failure. Next time, we'll find out how the lessons learned from that failure have led to the education system we know today.